Saints, will you pray with me? And is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah? No, it doesn't really, does it? Ooh, there we go. That sounds a little better. Now, will you pray with me? And as you feel so comfortable, I invite you to join in the second time through. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Amen. For those of you who don't know, the texts that we read most weeks come from a schedule of texts, the Revised Common Lectionary. It's a 3-year cycle of text through the seasons of the church and certain aspects. There's usually, except right after Easter usually, there's usually a text from the Hebrew Bible. There is a psalm, there is an epistle, so that's New Testament, like Paul's letters, and there's a selection from the gospel. And it comes up every 3 years, years A, B, and C. And so that means that once you've been in ministry for a while, you have seen the same texts come up a few times. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you can go back and you have a sermon that was just fabulous the first time around, and you can reuse that. So I looked back and saw it. Now, of course, now I don't use manuscripts as much, so I am not as lucky. Even if I've preached on it, I don't get to reuse it. But back when I did manuscripts, I looked back, and I've preached on these two texts at least twice before. And I read through the first one, which was at my first call in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. I was associate pastor, which meant that I preached about once a month, and I was, the young, fresh out of seminary sort of firestorm. And that was an interesting sermon that I preached that time. It was very much focused on the Isaiah text, which I actually use now most times on Ash Wednesday when we talk about fasting. But it was very prophetic themed. I started out saying, well, how are you this morning? Oh, you're doing great? Yeah, well, I'm really angry. And went from there. Talked about poverty in the United States and us calling ourselves Christian while all these things were happening. And while the points were valid, I'm not sure the manner probably sank in so much. And the second time I preached, it was not quite so pointed, but still very much kind of, we need to preach about justice issues, and sometimes that will make people uncomfortable, but we need to do this. So I considered, especially when I got a notification from NPR, I think, about, or maybe it wasn't NPR, maybe it was WMUR, something about the housing costs in New Hampshire and what the average monthly rent is, and then thinking about what the minimum wage is, and I thought, well, maybe with a little adjustment, this sermon from 9 years ago will actually be about right. And then a colleague of mine posted this wonderful quote that she read in a commentary about the text from Matthew. And I just thought, well, that's so much better. I need to go that direction instead. And it's about being salty, and not in the modern way of being salty, but what it means for a Christian to be salty. So first, the commentator is William Barclay, who is an older commentator. He wrote a little traditional, and his language is very gendered, just so you know. But he was talking about how Christians have been historically seen as not full of life and spirit so much. So he talks about how after Constantine made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, so before that Christians were persecuted. Early church, they had to hide, and then Constantine came and said, nope, you all have to be baptized at the pain of death and you're not a Christian. So it changed everything. But after that, after him, there was another emperor called Julian. And he didn't really like the Christians so much, and he kind of wanted to bring back the old gods. And so he puts it this way: have you looked at these Christians closely? Hollow-eyed, pale-cheeked, flat-breasted all. They brood their lives away, unspurred by ambition. The sun shines for them, but they do not see it. The earth offers them its fullness, but they desire it not. All their desire is to renounce and to suffer, that they may come to die. Absolute, that sounds like something I want to join into. I mean, I think we can imagine also some of our ancestors, like the Puritans, who also had this sort of reputation for this very dour, strict, not joyful way of being. Apparently, Robert Louis Stevenson once wrote in his diary, as if he were recording an extraordinary phenomenon, Barclay says, "I have been to church today and am not depressed." Now you can see how once I read that, I thought my original sermon telling everyone about how terrible it was to be calling ourselves Christian, where all these poverty was happening, maybe wasn't feeling the point. But Barclay goes on to discover this, and again, gendered, but you get the idea. Men need to discover the lost radiance of the Christian faith. In a worried world, the Christian should be the only man who remains serene. In a depressed world, the Christian should be the only man who remains full of the joy of life. There should be a sheer sparkle about the Christian, but too often he dresses like a mourner at a funeral and talks like a specter at a feast. Wherever he is, if he is to be the salt of the earth, the Christian must be the diffuser of joy. I was like, well, that'll bring a lot more people into church, won't it? Rather than being this sort of dour, like, desire to renounce and suffer that we may come to die, as Julian so posted to us. But I love this idea that he was saying we should sparkle. That this should be a core aspect of being a Christian, is to be a diffuser of joy in the world. Now, I don't think that he thought that that meant we couldn't talk about justice issues and how to address them, and certainly, I think he does believe we need to, but that it shouldn't be all dour, all staid and quiet and boring all the time. And so then he goes on to talk about the second part of Jesus's. So this passage from Matthew is a continuation of his Sermon on the Mount. So last week we had the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit. This week we are continuing in how to live as a follower of Christ, as a follower of God, as a faithful person. So then we have this image of this light. The light, and I remember actually talking about this story once with some kids from my time for all ages, because not one of them knew what a bushel basket was. I don't know if that's the case for the kids here, but if you don't, you can ask. That's what they put apples in usually. That's a bushel basket. But just this idea of the lamp, and the lamp that they would have been using at the time is not like our lanterns that we think of, but would have been sort of almost like a bowl with a wick in it. And they would have put a bushel over it when they left the house to protect it, so the house didn't burn down and so it didn't burn out too quickly, because it was pretty much usually the only light they had in the house. But of course, if it's the only light you have in your house, you're not going to keep it under the bushel when you are home. You're going to put it up so that it might shine well and full. It is meant to be seen. And so this is what Barclay continues. He says, Christianity is something which is meant to be seen. As someone has well said, there can be no such thing as secret discipleship, for either the secrecy destroys the discipleship, or the discipleship destroys the secrecy, which I thought was really interesting. Again, gender. A man's Christianity should be perfectly visible to all men. And further, the Christianity should not be only visible in the church. A Christianity whose effects stop at the door is not much use to anyone. And I think some of us struggle with that a little bit even nowadays. It should be even more visible in the ordinary activities of the world. Our Christianity should be visible in the way we treat a shop assistant at the counter, in the way we order a meal in a restaurant, in the way we treat our employees or serve our employer, in the way we play a game or drive or park a motor car, in the daily language we use, in the daily literature we read. A Christian should be just as much a Christian in the factory, the workshop, the shipyard, the mine, the schoolroom, the surgery, the kitchen, the golf course, the playing field, as he is in church. Jesus did not say, "You are the light of the church." He said, "You are the light of the world." And in a man's life in the world, his Christianity should be evident to all. Now, perhaps his perspective of what makes a Christian and what that looked like may be a little bit different than ours, and I think that's okay. But I think the idea that we should be living out in everything we do our Christian faith is an important one. And he goes on to make an important point, which connects to the Isaiah, which is that it is to be noted that our good deeds ought to draw attention not to ourselves, but to God. See, this is the issue that Isaiah has. Not that people are fasting, that they are, putting on sackcloth after they are doing these things, but that they are doing it for themselves. Again, sort of like last week we were talking about, to draw God's favor. They're doing it not to please God, really in a way that, because this is what God desires for the world, but in order to gain favor to God, in order for God to see them better, for other people to see them better. Oh, look at me, how holy I am. I'm sure we know some people, either personally or in the media, who sort of do that. Look at how holy I am. That's not what we're talking about. This is, this saying of Jesus is a total prohibition of what someone has called theatrical goodness. I love that phrase, theatrical goodness. It is that playing the part of a good Christian person in order to be seen as a good Christian person and not as a living out of our faith. God wants us to be salty and sparkly and to shine our light in the world, and in that way draw people to God, to the teachings of Jesus, to deeper discipleship, not as a way to make ourselves look good. This light that we shine out is not our own personal light, but the light of Christ that we are reflecting into the world. And the Quakers have an idea that every single person in the world has a divine spark in them, that light of the divine within them. And it is one reason that they are devout pacifists, because there is no reason that any human being should put out that divine spark of any other human being. We can, without causing death sometimes, put out others' divine sparks. That spark of faith, of curiosity, of goodness that might just be struggling a little bit. We can put it out in our words or actions, or we can give it a little. You've ever been done a campfire? Just a little blow, a little encouragement to glow brighter, to encourage them to be sparkly like salt, to shine their own reflection of God's light in the world. You are salt of the earth. let your light shine before the whole world. It's not easy sometimes, especially in our increasing secular age and in an age where Christians are not always viewed with the most positive light. Use that phrase. But perhaps by shining our light, by living our lives as disciples of Christ in every way we can change that. And even if we don't, we will know that we have lived as truly and as fully as we can as disciples of Christ, as reflections of God's light in the world. Amen.